So did everyone have the opportunity to read through Galatians, or at least start to? It's not that long. We'll start digging into it a little bit today. And then next week, if we get through this part, we can go into some specifics, especially some of those messier, troublesome passages that like to make you reach for the antacid on your shelf and everything. Today, of course, we need to do a little bit of background and really discuss what makes Galatians so problematic for so many different groups of people. When you hear the word Galatians, do you cringe? Do you want to wring your hands in frustration and try to explain to the people of faith in your life that Shaul, that Paul actually and greatly favored and taught Torah, and that by saying so you are not in fact being legalistic? Yes? No? Maybe? Out of all the books of the apostolic scriptures, Shaul's letter to the Galatians often presents the most challenges for messianic believers. Actually, strike that. I can safely say that it is so often the most challenging of Shaul's letters for Jews, Gentiles, as well as messianic believers. Why is that? After a rudimentary reading of the text, most tend to consider Galatians to be the final word on what a Gentile believer's relationship to the law of Moses should be. In other words, they may contend that if you, as a believer, want to know if the law of Moses has any relevancy at all for us today, all you need to do is read the book of Galatians to see what Shaul tells us in no uncertain terms that we are to forsake the old and embrace the new. Shaul, it seems at first blush, sees the law of Moses as being outdated and unnecessary for faith. He seems to condemn anyone who claims that the law of Moses has any place in the life of a believer who was born again, as it were, and has come to faith in Messiah Yeshua. It appears that he was overtly afraid for anyone giving the law any kind of merit or due diligence. Indeed, there are some, scholars as well as lay members, who go as far as to suggest that Shaul feels that any such person, that is, someone who gives the law any kind of credence whatsoever, is on the precipice of apostasy. The precipice of apostasy. There would be some who would probably say that I own a vacation home there, on the precipice of apostasy. That's all right. It's got a nice view. Why would anyone consider this manner of thinking apostasy? Perhaps this is all a wee bit overstated. It does, however, serve to capture a fair amount of rhetoric that we, as Messianic Jews and Gentiles, tend to encounter in conversations with Christian friends and family. As Messianic believers today, we advocate that God is restoring a Torah foundation to his people. He is calling us back to obedience in his ways. Let me ask you this, and this is a rhetorical question. Is God more interested in your joy or your obedience? Just throwing that out there. We practice this by studying the Torah and the prophets, by doing things such as observing Shabbat, the Moedim, or appointed times, and for many, observing at least biblical kashrut. It is our hope that in most cases the desire to do such things is because a person strives to grow in his or her faith and to emulate the life of Messiah, the life of a disciple. In other words, if the Master did these things and they were important to him, should they not be important to us? Should we not at least consider their merit? As I have discussed many times before, and this is something many well-intentioned friends and family in the church fail to understand, the motives of a spirit-filled messianic believer should not be to try to rely on our personal efforts to gain favor, or worse, salvation. Rather, we allow those actions to come because of a deep and abiding love for the one who created us, who breathed life into us, and who made us in his image. We acknowledge all he has done for us. As our relationship with him grows, not only are our hearts transformed, but we foster a desire that is focused on the Holy One and is able to reason and wrestle with complicated issues as they arise. The bottom line is this: despite natural theological differences between people, Jewish as well as non-Jewish believers should be one in Messiah, serving one another in obedience to his ways and his wishes. And we all agree on that, at least. Galatians is one of those texts of Scripture where we come face to face with difficult concepts. As such, it is imperative that we seek to understand context, context, context. Say it with me. Context. We are thousands of years removed from Shaul and his audience. We have a radically different culture and worldview. And that culture, like it or not, taints our understanding in ways that we may expect, as well as ways that we cannot even imagine. It is all but impossible for us, if we do not have this in mind, to see the Bible through anything other than the rose-colored glasses of our own cultural bias. More commentaries and biblical studies have probably been written on the book of Galatians and its emphasis on freedom from the law than any other text in all of Scripture. Indeed, most of the Protestant Reformation can be attributed to the book of Galatians, as Martin Luther appropriated its words on justification to refute Catholicism's common practice of selling indulgences at that time. Let me take a time out for just a moment. When I speak of justification, do you know of what I speak? Justification is the concept of our salvation or of our being made righteous before the Holy One. It concerns itself with how our salvation is gained. Are we justified or made righteous by faith or by works? This is what we mean when we refer to justification, and Shaul deals with this a lot in his letter to those in Galatia. Galatians is sometimes used when legalists, quote unquote, enter the community of faith and insist that a person live up to a certain set of righteous standards or righteous living. Some pastors and Bible scholars knowingly or unknowingly take Galatians out of its Hebraic context. Messianic believers who place a high emphasis on the Torah are easy targets for being accused of being under the law and shunning grace, especially when Shaul has so much to say about the misuse of the law of Moses in his writing to the Galatians. Again, why is this? There is a plethora of reasons, of course. The foremost, perhaps, is that the book of Galatians is so often examined and interpreted from a perspective that is largely distanced from the first century audience to which it was originally addressed. Paul says all kinds of things with the assumption that his audience knows what he's talking about, which is true. As I often say, if I tell you today, I'm sorry I was late, I had car trouble, I don't have to first explain what a car is. You know what a car is. But 2,000 years from now, they may not know what I'm talking about. Rather than considering the specific spiritual, political, and social dynamics of a group of newly maturing followers of Yeshua who were challenged that their ethnic beliefs and ways were not enough for true faith, redemption, and inclusion among God's people, many interpreters consider Galatians to be Shaul's magnum opus on the church's unapologetic divorce from the Torah of Moses. The message of Galatians, the exact audience of Galatians, and some of the historical background surrounding Galatians have all been debated across the centuries. Without question, the major theme of Shaul's letter is a warning about altering the gospel message. Some within that community were attempting to amend the spiritual truth that salvation comes through the finished work of Messiah on the cross, and through no external action on our part. But what these amendments were specifically, as well as who was introducing these errors to the Galatians, these are some of the questions that are still strenuously debated. Biblical scholars who fall into the camp of thinking that Galatians is the Magna Carta of Christian freedom from all things Jewish, then likened the book of Romans to the Constitution for believers everywhere. Since the Reformation, Galatians has been an important text for the foundational concept of justification by faith. Today's Messianic movement would likely not be in existence without many of the good things that came from the Protestant Reformation. But as good and as essential as we may consider the Reformation, to what extent did the Reformers' conclusions go too far? How limited were the early Reformers, such as Martin Luther, John Calvin, in using a text like Galatians to refute the errors that they saw in medieval Catholicism? When Shaul actually wrote Galatians to strictly admonish a group of new believers in the 1st century, the question remains, just how much have we been affected by some misappropriation of the original intent of Galatians? Let me say clearly, for all who question where I might be going with this, no Bible believer true to God's word should ever deny the doctrine of salvation by grace. Our salvation is brought about by our faith in the atoning sacrifice of Yeshua. We can do no more than he did on the cross. We cannot earn salvation. Shaul makes this clear in Romans when he said in chapter 3, verse 28, "For we maintain that a person is justified by faith apart from the works of the law." And again in Ephesians 2, 8 through 9, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not of yourselves. It is a gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast." Having said that, how many in the church have been introduced to a view of justification that is removed in some very specific places from its Hebraic roots and context in the first covenant? While righteousness is certainly a personal status that God can afford to people, righteousness is not just an individualistic concept. For the Jews of the 1st century, there was a corporate or national sense of righteousness that involved being a part of God's covenant people, those designated as his own. This is true even today. We speak not only of individual salvation, but of national or corporate salvation as well. Ask yourself this. When Shaul addresses justification in Galatians, is he talking about a personal status that believers have in Messiah? Or are there places where he is also talking about the corporate relationship of men and women to one another as members of God's community of chosen people? Recognizing the possibility of this duality when reading Galatians may force a person to reevaluate some of his or her Western individuality, something that was nearly foreign to 1st century Judaism. To Shaul and the other apostles, it was not sufficient to be justified individually before God. One was interconnected with other men and women of faith who shared the same belief in Messiah, functioning together to accomplish his purposes. It is most likely that there are some places in Galatians where the justification in view concerns membership in God's people, and others where some kind of vindication from sins is in view. Why is this important? Corporate justification is important to consider because of the inclusion of non-Jewish believers in the 1st century community of faith. Remember that Galatians was likely written prior to the Jerusalem Council of Acts 15. There were things that still needed to be figured out. There were concerns and unknowns still being debated. Shaul concluded that faith in Yeshua for non-Jews resulted in one having become a part of the Israel of God, as it says in Galatians 6:16. Something that was contrary to the prevailing Jewish theology of that time. The Mishnah attests to a widespread view at that time that all members of Israel were assured eternal salvation on the sole basis of their ethnicity. And according to the Talmud, if one Jew would properly observe Shabbat, but 2 times in his or her life, it would merit immediate redemption. These prevailing beliefs were ideas that Shaul walked into in Galatia. Shaul does not say that one's bloodline guarantees an individual a righteous status before God. He does say that the work of Messiah Yeshua has brought a new status beyond the distinctions of Jew and non-Jew. He tells us, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Messiah Yeshua. That was Galatians 3:28, an oft-quoted verse used to promote the idea that we no longer need anything related to Torah or tradition. Shaul's opponents would have argued against this, and they would have instead argued that something in addition to belief in Yeshua was necessary for Gentile inclusion among God's people. It was belief in Yeshua plus baptism, or plus circumcision, or plus obligation to keep the law of Moses in its entirety. Many in Galatia found themselves deserting Shaul's teachings for those introduced by others, and Shaul was greatly concerned by this. He had forged a close relationship with this community in his previous visits, almost as a parent toward children. In Galatians 4:19 and 20, he refers to them in this way: "My children, with whom I am again in labor until Messiah is formed in you. But I could wish to be present with you now and to change my tone of voice, for I am at a loss about you." One of the key issues discussed in Shaul's letter is that of circumcision. When Shaul is said to be teaching a circumcision-free or law-free gospel, what is he advocating specifically? Has he cast aside the instructions of the Torah, as many have said? Or is he arguing against circumcision of the flesh as a means for salvation? If Shaul was against circumcision once a person became a believer in Messiah Yeshua, then why did he agree to circumcise Timothy in Acts 16? What must Shaul truly explain to the Galatians about their spiritual walk? What had caused the discord among the believers? These are things that we must ponder and carefully examine when we read the letter. So now that we have our cogs and our gears turning, let us consider some foundational things before we get into specifics. The first thing we must ask ourselves is to whom the letter of Galatians was written. I see the way you're looking at me. It was written to the Galatians, right? Fair enough. But who were the Galatians? I'm guessing that it will come as no surprise to you that the target audience of Shaul's epistle to the Galatians has been vigorously debated and contested among scholars for hundreds of years. What in the Bible is not vigorously debated? Every scholar I have read agrees at least that we can place the location of Galatia somewhere in Central Asia Minor, and that this is a letter which Shaul specifically wrote to a group of congregations, the assemblies of Galatia, as it says in Galatians 1:2. Being able to accurately identify the audience of Galatians is a debate that continues in contemporary academic circles today, and it will probably continue until the end of time. The two main camps of thought are that Galatia either represents an ethnic group of people or a geopolitical group of people. And regardless of which of these two camps one favors, much of the intended audience in Galatia, either ethnic or political, was relatively new, non-Jewish believers in Yeshua. And we'll leave it at that, at least for now. When did Shaul write his letter? This too is complicated. For our purpose, let us just say that it was likely written again prior to Acts 15 and the Jerusalem Council. If it was written after the council, Shaul would most certainly have referred to it in his letter. Where was Shaul when he wrote his epistle? Theologians cannot seem to agree as to where he was when he wrote the words. Surprise, surprise. He probably was not in downtown Miami. That seems at least a safe bet. And finally, what is the overall theological message of Galatians? This can be difficult to say because Shaul's emotions are so deeply intertwined throughout his words. We can be certain that Shaul had personally known and that he had worked among his Galatian audience. These were not strangers to him. This is probably why his feelings come through so clearly, as he had an emotional investment in what he was saying. It is not surprising, given the time and effort he dedicated to them, that he was greatly disturbed at their alarming spiritual course of action. The common assertion among scholars is that the book of Galatians was written to counter the polemics of a group commonly called the Judaizers. Polemics is just a fancy word that simply means a strong verbal or written attack of something. It is widely believed that this group was comprised of Jewish believers in Yeshua who insisted that observance of the whole Mosaic law should be required for faith and belief in Yeshua. In other words, for centuries it was believed that Messianic Jews of the first century were responsible for trying to add to salvation things outside of grace or faith. These so-called Judaizers, and it may surprise you to know that this term never appears anywhere in the Bible, swayed a great deal of influence over the young Galatian believers. Furthermore, they argued that Shaul was not an authentic apostle. Naturally, he was very distraught over this, as the Galatians had once received him and his message enthusiastically. He tells the Galatians that to be circumcised in the flesh in order to gain merit would take them down a very tenuous path. And thus, we have the common thread seen throughout the book of Galatians. There are many today, especially Messianic theologians, who are considering new and intriguing factors regarding his letter. What, for example, is the circumcision about which he warned? And in his own handwriting, no less. His language is very interesting here. Let's read together, if you wish, Galatians 6, starting with verse 11. See with what large letters I am writing to you with my own hand. Seems important for him to put it in such a manner, I think. Continuing, those who desire to make a good showing in the flesh try to compel you to be circumcised, do not even keep the law themselves, but they desire to have you circumcised that you may boast in your flesh. But may it never be that I would boast except in the cross of our Lord Messiah Yeshua, through which the world has been crucified to me and I to the world. And here's another interesting bit, verse 15. For neither is circumcision anything, nor uncircumcision, but a new creation. And he finishes his thought with this. And those who will walk by this rule, shalom and mercy be upon them, and upon the Israel of God. Is this just a warning about a medical procedure, the physical removal of flesh? What, if anything, has the power of Yeshua and his message changed? We must consider the possibility that circumcision, as spoken of by Shaul here, is more a term for ritual proselyte conversion, but more on that later. The overall religious environment of Galatia is something that may not have been considered historically, not just as it concerns the Judaism of Shaul's day, but also the prevailing Roman imperial region. This religion was prominent throughout the province of Galatia, and it may have provided a powerful external social push for non-Jewish Galatians to want to convert to Judaism, thereby undergoing circumcision. The text of Galatians itself is rough. I don't know what other word to use compared to Shaul's other letters. Is this only on account of his strong emotions toward people he knows personally and for whom he cares deeply? Or is there more to consider? As one of the earliest apostolic writings, it is probably safe to say that Galatians does not represent all of Shaul's thoughts regarding the inclusion of non-Jews in the mixed Jewish community of believers. When thinking through Galatians, analyzing the text by itself without consultation of other Pauline writings is ill-advised at best. It would not behoove us, as serious students of the word, to do so. Shaul often clarified his statements in other letters that can be misconstrued if read in isolation. Shaul's words, much like the rest of the words in the Bible, were not written in a vacuum. So to summarize for today, I believe a responsible interpreter and student of Galatians has much to weigh when considering the text. I do not believe that it is difficult to reconcile the seeming differences between Yeshua's and Shaul's words on the Torah. But in order to do this, we must gain a proper perspective. What are the circumstances surrounding Shaul's composition of Galatians? From what issues were those in Galatia suffering? What were the spiritual dynamics at work? These are all important questions that we should consider when examining any biblical text, but they are imperative to consider when reading Galatians. We cannot simply interject what we think the text might mean, nor can we just throw our hands up in the air and ignore it either. We have to do the difficult work of exegesis, being guided by sound theology, rooted in the Torah, and embodied in the worldview of Shaul. Next time, I'd like to really get into who the audience of the letter was. I think it's imperative for us to understand this. Failure to do so leads to all manner of crazy interpretations. A lot can happen when we change the interpretation or the wording of a few simple words. Perspective, of course, is everything. When I say to people, for example, have a nice day, I'm considered to be a kind person. But when I say enjoy the next 24 hours, for some reason eyebrows are raised. What's the difference? I also encourage you to read, or continue reading through Galatians and come with your questions about ideas, specific or messy passages and thoughts. I believe that we will discover that Galatians' message and what it really communicates is as relevant for our times now as much as it was in the first century. The challenge is whether or not we will actually heed its important message. The obstacle to overcome is having the spiritual and reasoning capacities to compute what the ancient challenge actually was, and whether we are indeed facing it in our midst again today. How can we be a people who embody the essence of Shaul's declaration in Galatians 5:14? For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, in the statement, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. How can we be that people while responding to some of the criticisms against the law commonly derived from Galatians? How can we be men and women who strive to obey the Holy One as a natural outworking of our faith, rather than something that is required to precede faith? Those are my questions for you. And I leave you with that and open the floor.